Hello, great souls. Welcome to our Living Yoga Satsang. Let's begin together with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, great masters of self-realization, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Shri Yukteswar, and Paramahansa Yoganandaji, saints of all religions, friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, we humbly bow to you all. Help us to awaken, to remember our divine nature, to attune our consciousness with thy divine consciousness, to feel the promise of yoga, union, one with all that is. Om, peace. Amen. Okay, so I was speaking with a friend briefly yesterday who told me she's really been enjoying these talks of yoga and the 12 steps, and she said, now what? She had just watched, I think, the last talk on the step 12, now what do we do? And it was really a perfect question, so I just want to address that a little bit and talk about it in both the 12-step context and also the yoga context. So in 12-step circles, once you've completed the 12 steps, there's a few different ways in which you practice. One is that you go through them again in a systematic approach, and each time you go more deeply into the practice and the understanding of the steps. And so some people will take workshops on this. There are meetings that are step meetings, and they just keep repeating. And I'm often reminded in yoga of Raja Yoga. That's one of the programs many people repeat. So we have this coming up in the fall. If you haven't taken it, I highly recommend it. And if you have, and it's even if it hasn't been that long, you might want to retake it. So there's a similar way in the yoga practice and path where we revisit the material. And so with the 12 steps, sometimes we revisit it systematically, 1 through 12. We go through that again. Another way that we practice is as it is relevant. So once you've completed the 12 steps, the idea is that you're now living these spiritual principles in your life. You're carrying the message of this way of life to all who are interested, to all who are wanting it. Right? And that's also a practice in yoga that we share and we offer and share and we serve to those who want it. Right? So it's not a practice in which we go out and convince anybody, hey, this is a great idea and you ought to do it. We are not evangelists, right, in that way. What we are, and again, this comes from, there's a phrase in 12 steps that applies in both, which is attraction rather than promotion. So that is a principle in yoga. Right? We live the teachings, we practice the teachings, and if others are interested, we happily share the teachings. It's very important, this part. So in the 12th step, so these are the approaches, the now what do we do? And I thought it might be helpful to choose the, basically focus on pieces of the material, of the teachings, rather than go back through the steps 1 through 12. And the first that came to mind to me to share and dive deeply into are the Yamas and Niyamas from Patanjali. So these are the guidelines for behavior for yoga, and we looked at them in step 4 when we're taking a personal inventory. And the Yamas and Niyamas, so there's a few things I'll say about them, and then each week I thought I would take one and talk about it and how we practice it and what it is, and just invite you and us together to go a little more deeply into them. So let's see, some of the first things to say. So this comes from Patanjali, Ashtanga Yoga, which is the 8 limbs of realization, really the path that Patanjali said all truth seekers will go through these stages on the way to realization, whichever tradition they follow. and he outlined them. And within them are the yamas and niyamas. So, as I mentioned, they're considered, sometimes referred to as the moral guidelines. Another piece of information that's very helpful in the practice of them is that these are not kind of handed down with a heavy hand from God. Like, you must do this, right? The energy of the yamas and niyamas is they are rules or guidelines for conduct that are based on, if we are attuned with our divine nature, what we would naturally be doing. So these support the natural law. These support natural law. The human journey is such that, by the time we come to yamas and niyamas, we've gotten off track usually. So we need help remembering, like we need help with some guidelines here. But the idea is that I'm not a bad person being corrected, right? Like these aren't rules because I'm naturally a sinner. That's not the truth. In yoga teaching, my essence, our essence is divine. And we've gotten off track. So in our Sunday service, Swami Kriyananda wrote a beautiful allegory for the soul that we share every Sunday to talk about. And the soul is represented in the bird and the bird's long journey. It's just really what happens as human beings. We come into the body and the energy enters and goes outward. And so rather than stay central to who we are in our nature, we go outward and explore this world around us, and we get caught up in an external experience. Yogananda said that our ego is the aspect of the soul that is identified with this body and the material realm. And it's that aspect of the soul that's on the journey of awakening, right? I always think of it as the larger part of who we are. We're already self-realized. So it's this interesting reality, I'll have to say, that we are both already self-realized, and it's a matter of remembering that. And the journey is one of remembering. That's what's happening with yoga. So the yamas and niyamas help us remember. When we act in accordance with our divine truth, our divine self, that which obscures it is removed. So the yamas, also sometimes referred to as the don'ts, they are the restraints. These are the behaviors we restrain from doing. We refrain from them. And the more that we practice them, the more we remove from ourself that which is obscuring the divine light within. That's a simple way of talking about the yamas. The niyamas, which I'll go into after we go through the 5 yamas, are what's called the observances. And they very much are, when we're in our natural state of our divine essence, we simply observe, we live this way. Right? It could be said of both, truly. So the first yama is ahimsa, non-violence or harmlessness. And Gandhi, as well as Dr. Martin Luther King, both of them were shining examples of how to practice this and what it looks like and what is it. So many people have heard of ahimsa before because of them, these 2 great souls who demonstrated the power of ahimsa for transforming consciousness. And it is extraordinary. One of the things that Swami Kriyananda talks about is that ahimsa is often misunderstood, and truly the dynamic power that it carries. So the perfection of ahimsa, and Patanjali provides that for every one of the yamas and niyamas. What does it look like when we've perfected it? And the perfection of ahimsa is that wild animals, our ferocious criminals, are powerless in our presence. And Yogananda demonstrated this. Right? There are stories of him in India, where one time he was with the boys in his school that he had for boys, where a tiger was coming, and I believe the cow, I've heard it in different ways, but there was a cow that needed to be secured. And so he was able to go out and, in the presence, the tiger in his presence became like a kitten. He just completely responded to this divine being and his consciousness of perfect love. And so wild animals that would normally instinctually attack, they just would, they don't. I had the experience a few years ago of being at the Oakland Zoo, very sweet zoo, and I was there. And we were at I was with one of my older brothers. We were at the tiger cage, and it was a quiet time of day. And one of the trainers, I wouldn't call him a trainer. He was probably a keeper. He wasn't a trainer. He was a keeper, happened to be there and was talking to us about the nature of the tigers. And they really make an effort to protect their nature. They're not trying to domesticate these animals. They're trying to protect them. They come to the zoo for different reasons, and the zoo's intention is to be kind to them, right? And just support them. Anyway, he was saying, it's deceptive, tigers, because you spend time with them. He did every day, fed them. And as we were looking at them, it was a lazy afternoon, and they were up on these platforms. And I happen to love cats, so it reminded me of my kitty. Like, they're just stretched out, basking in the sun. And they were so relaxed. They have a way of looking harmless. And he said it's deceptive. It looks like, and then you feed them every day, and they seem harmless, all his interaction. Of course, he's never inside the cage. Well, he told us one day he was there going to feed them, and they were, in their spot, and there's a special caged area he would go into, put the food in, and then leave, and then you open it and they go in. So he was setting the food up, and he happened to crouch down to get something, and instantly, he no sooner crouched down that he heard the weight, which is hundreds of pounds, I don't know how much they weigh, slam into the fence behind him. And the tiger attacked. He went to attack instinctually. And it just knocked him over, the sound of it. And he was pointing out how ferocious they are. Without any complaint, he just said that's what they are. That's their nature. So I like to think of that in terms of there's Master Yogananda in a wild tiger in the jungle, and that tiger became like a cat that he could pet, right? I don't know that he was purring, but he was happy. So there's also stories of him where criminals, there were some criminals, some men with guns who came up at him in an alley, and as soon as they saw him, they dropped their guns. And all he did was look at them. And they were so confused by what was going on and said, "What are you doing to us? Right? What have you done?" And they ran off. So this is perfection of Ahimsa. Right? And we have that to show us as a model for what's possible for us, that we can be so aligned with this principle of non-harming that we're emanating that. And all beings, all creatures can feel it. So, and respond in kind. So then we look at, well, where am I in this moment, right? So I'm not there yet, but I'm aware of. I'm not testing it in the tiger cage, but I have reason to believe I've not perfected it yet, so I'm working on it. And what does working on it look like? Well, part of what Swamiji says, and this is, I'm referring directly from Raja Yoga when I'm talking about this, or other things that Swamiji or Yogananda have written. So what he's saying, what Swamiji says, is that Ahimsa is more than what is obvious. So non-harming, non-violence, the obvious of that is hitting or, doing something violent to another human being. That would be the more obvious thing we definitely want to restrain from. Usually what we say is that when we've come to studying this, probably that's not our biggest, that for many of us that would likely not be an issue. I won't say for everyone, but for many of us it would likely be that the obvious practice of Ahimsa, we've already achieved that. So then what do we do? Then what does Ahimsa look like? And the more subtle practice of it can be found in our thoughts and in our energy, as well as in our speech. So I was, as I was preparing for today, I was remembering a story that Asha told about how we can we can just so quickly kind of go to something without meaning to. And Ahimsa, it's relevant in this way. She was in a motorhome traveling, and she was standing up getting ready to make a sandwich, and the whole motorhome jerked, and the peanut butter flew off the counter and landed on her foot. And so it was a heavy jar. And she noticed that instantly she was mad, right? She just, like, as soon as it hit, it hurt. And she saw within her this rising energy that wanted to be mad and wanted to blame and kind of strike out to the person who's driving. What did you do? Why did you do it? I don't think she said any of that. She just noticed within her this fiery energy that was instantaneous to the pain. And that was quite an awareness for her. And I've always appreciated that example because just looking within ourselves, what happens when we're injured? Right? So we're practicing non-injury, and what happens when we're injured? Do we spontaneously respond with kindness and compassion and warmth and expansiveness? Not often. That's not often the first thing that comes up. So we're practicing that. Sometimes it does. I've seen parents do that with children. Many times I've seen that. I've also seen parents get really frustrated with children, which is completely understandable. But I have seen parents respond to harsh words from a child or pounding on them or, like the child striking out. They're frustrated, they're angry. And the parent just being so non-harming in response. And it's a beautiful thing to see. So this is part of it. Sister Gyanamata, Yogananda called her his foremost female disciple. One of her comments that has been very meaningful to me, she said, we're not responsible for the first response to anything that happens in our consciousness. We are responsible for the second one. So that reactivity of, oh, this fell on my toe and it hurts and I'm mad and I want to strike out, or anybody did anything, right? If whenever we're hurt, that you can feel that energy of anger. You could feel the energy of wanting to strike back. Ahimsa is not doing that. And so learning how to have command of our energy and our consciousness so that we respond differently. And this is really where the path of yoga and the spiritual practice, the spiritual principles diverge from the worldly consciousness, mass consciousness. The worldly consciousness, in my experience, gets very fixated on justifiable anger. Things that I have a right to be mad about. I have a right to be angry. I have a right to strike out. I have a right to be unkind. Look what happened to me. And in the spiritual practice, that is never a justification for harming. Right? There are no justifications for harming, and this is a really subtle point, with the intention to harm. So here's what I want to say about that. Sometimes, and this would be an example in the military, sometimes the right thing to do is to kill. Okay, wow. So let's say that's the right action. That's the appropriate action. If that is performed with a sense of duty and a sense of dharma, without anger and rage, and boy, this is how it's taught, right? Like, it is possible to kill without anger and rage. And I remember one time watching an interview with those in military training at West Point, and it was really impressive to me how refined these students were being taught about the basics being violence, right, is the last option here. That's the last thing that you want to do. War is the last thing. In fact, there's a sense of failure if we get to that point. So, but the idea is, what is the attitude I'm carrying with anything that I do? We're not intentionally harming. right? So I would say another way of looking at this could be the difference between self-defense. If you are defending your own body and defending yourself out of honoring and respecting the life you've been given, that's very different than being aggressive and intentionally looking for a fight. There's an expression, spoiling for a fight. Right? You're kind of looking for someone to be angry at, looking to be in a fight with someone else. And it can happen that we get into those dynamics where people in our life will support that, right? So people get into fighting dynamics, and it happens. And it's a response pattern that gets built up. Dr. Peter gives a talk about the brain. He's got some lovely talks about the neuroplasticity of the brain and how malleable our brains are. And there were studies done on anger. One of them, and they looked at, kind of different approaches for managing anger. One of the approaches was to feel it intensely and express it. Not at any particular person, but to be in a safe space where you could verbally express it, physically express it, and energetically express it. Continually, like a lot, like you just kept doing that as a way of working with the energy and being done with the energy. One of the approaches was one of meditation, which is why he was talking about this. And I forget the third approach. The meditation approach was very successful in creating space between an experience and the response to that experience. It's a huge thing that yoga offers us, is the ability to have command of our energy. So that now something's happened, I might be aware that, ouch, I want to strike out, but I don't have to. That's freedom. And so those who were expressing continuously the anger, what happened is that at the end of the study, they found that they got angry more frequently and faster. So what Dr. Peter was saying is that the brain had done its job very effectively. And he said that the brain is simply observing all the time what we're doing. What are our thoughts? What are the thoughts that we repeat? What are the actions we repeat? What are the words that we repeat? It pays attention and gives us more of that. It says, oh, good, that's what you want. Oh, is that what you wanted to do? Did you want to be angry? Okay, I could help with that. And so then it calls in all the forces to help us get angry more quickly and faster, maybe stay angry longer. It's stunning to think of that. And so much of his talk is, he often begins with, who would you like to be 6 months from now? Looking at the brain, looking at how we work with the brain, what we offer our brain through practice. So the practice of Ahimsa, our yoga practices, first we need to understand the concept, which is what I'm talking about today. It's like, okay, get a sense of what is that. Another thing that Swami talks about in the subtlety of the practice is that we can harm someone by killing their enthusiasm. So if someone has an idea for something, and maybe I think, I don't know if that's going to work, right? I don't see the practicality of it, or I'm not sure. But for them, they have a lot of energy around it, and it feels really important to them. If I were to simply slice at that with facts and information of all the ways in which it wouldn't work, I could really kill and hurt their spirit. I remember a private student I was working with, and she was very excited about a goal. The goal itself seemed fine, but her approach to it seemed unrealistic. She set a goal for herself and a timeline, and I said, does that seem realistic to you? Right? So I was her mentor, I was her teacher, so it's okay to ask that question. Definitely it's realistic. I know I can do it. And I rested on the principle, certainly of Ahimsa, but also what Yogananda taught, which is never to kill somebody's enthusiasm and their spirit. And the truth is, what do I know, right? Like, it didn't seem realistic, but she was convinced, so what's the harm in trying? And she did. Right? She tried it. She wasn't able to meet that goal in that period of time. She felt discouraged, but what I was able to help her with is use it as a learning moment rather than feel like a failure. You learned something about yourself. That's probably not a realistic timeline. The goal's fine. The goal's a good goal. So we can just regroup and try again. And she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Well, do you remember me asking?" And she said, "I do," but she didn't want to hear it. We'll talk later another day about truthfulness. That's where we're truthful with ourselves, or how hard it can be. But I also wanted her to know I didn't impose my sense on the timeline because I don't know. It's a thought. It seemed unrealistic, but she might have been able to do it. More important to let that energy rise and just let her stay dynamic. And then catch it if there's a little, I mean, my gosh, it was just a very small correction. Let's just extend the timeline. Let's use everything you've done up to this point, keep going, right? And that was very helpful and useful for her because she also was in training to work with other people. So we could look at it in that way. So when you're working with others, you can offer things, but you don't want to squelch somebody's enthusiasm. Swami tells the famous story about this where Master had been away. He came back and Swami was on a grape diet. And Master was all about balance. And he said, "What is it that you're eating?" "Oh, we're very enthusiastically, we're eating grapes as a way of purifying our system." And he said, "Okay, well, you've already committed to this, so continue. But once you're done with it, don't do this again." And it was a teaching of don't kill the spirit, don't kill the energy, and also be balanced, right? So that was the lesson in that. So these things to be aware of in ourselves, there's a simplicity to it, and sometimes it can feel so simple in concept. You know, what's the point? I find continually that these guidelines, they do help me tap into the inner freedom. The more that they're in my consciousness to practice them, the more that I ask others or observe how others practice them, the stronger my spiritual life becomes, and the more strength and inner fortification I feel to respond to life from the reference point of the divine self. So I offer for you this week to explore Ahimsa and look at it in the context of how you relate to yourself. Because oftentimes we're not as kind to ourselves as it would be good to be, right? So look at how you think about yourself, how you speak to yourself about yourself. You know, are you killing your own enthusiasm for something, being overly critical instead of giving yourself a chance to explore something and try it? And also how you relate to others. And see what happens from this very simple practice of kindness, compassion, loving to all. In Raja, Swami says, Jesus is teaching, love thy neighbor as thyself. From yoga perspective, love thy neighbor, he is thyself. So any love and kindness we extend to others, we benefit from that. Our own soul shines more brightly with this practice. So wishing you many blessings, dear soul. Beautiful to be with you again today.